Hi, this is Chris Foreman from Madness, and you're listening to the Stateside Madness podcast.
Hi there, folks out there. I'd like you to meet Tommy McGuire and his combo.
Hello, and welcome to the Stateside Madness podcast, the one and only podcast with the official Madness American fan service. I'm Laurie, along with my co-host Polly, here to bring you news, reviews, and deep dives into the nutty sound of the British pop band Madness. Well, hello, Madness fans. Welcome to another episode of the Stateside Madness podcast. I'm Laurie.
And I'm Polly.
Today, we're going to continue our series of episodes about Madness adjacent bands. Is that correct, Polly?
Yeah, I guess we never really termed, we're trying to be Madness centric, but not just go over all the stuff that everybody knows.
Well, especially since now we're going on the third year that we're doing this. So there's only so much that is specific Madness content that we have. So we're going to talk about a band called The Voice of the Beehive, of which Betters and Woody were both founding members. But before we do, Polly, I have something for the communicator.
All right, then, let's hear it.
All right, so the big news is the band has announced there's going to be a vinyl re-release of The Liberty of Norton Folgate on 180-gram vinyl. This is a 2-album set, gatefold, and it's notable because it's going to include a number of bonus tracks that have never been included on vinyl before, such as Let's Go, Hunchback of Toriano, and Fish and Chips. So that's pretty exciting for you vinyl collectors out there.
Yeah, and now rereading it, just prior to taping, I told Laurie I would probably pass on this one as I paid up for the original box set of Norton Folgate, but it's kind of like one of those things. If I read about it, I might just get hooked. And looking at it now, yeah, so Fish and Chips that you mentioned, One Fine Day also, The Kiss. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff on there. I suppose I'm just going to have to buy it.
Now, it also includes some new liner notes containing interviews with Suggs, Lee Thompson, Chrissy Boy Foreman, Daniel Woodgate, and Mike Barson, as well as an exclusive poem by Carl Smith. Now, that has me a little bit intrigued. So that's expected on February 24th of 2023.
Tell you how I feel. I'm scared.
Chris, what time is it?
Showtime!
So, Ollie, The Voice of the Beehive. Are you familiar with them?
Yes, definitely familiar. How could you not be at this point? In the very least, if you're bored and looking up Madness-related stuff, you're going to know at some point that Betters and Woody were members of this band. And as such, how can you say, well, I'm not going to look any further? Oh, of course, you're going to look it up. You're going to listen to it, and you're going to try to find out a little bit about it. As I have, and as I know you know a great deal more about them than I do.
Well, I didn't until this last week. I've really been immersing myself in all things Voice of the Beehive. I did buy the new re-release, the 35th anniversary re-release of their album Let It Be, that has a lot of B-sides and rarities on it. So that's pretty cool. In listening to it immersively, as I've been doing, I understand now why so many people get the Voice of the Beehive confused with Book of Love, because there are some similarities in the way the bands sound. It's a very different sound than Madness. It's certainly not ska by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm a little bit excited that we're actually taking things in a little bit of a different direction today.
Yeah, we should get right to it.
Cool. Well, the Voice of the Beehive story actually begins in the 1950s with a Los Angeles quartet called the Four Preps. They had several hits, but their biggest one was 26 Miles, Santa Catalina in 1958. Let's give a little listen here.
26 miles across the sea, Santa Catalina is awaiting for me. Santa Catalina, the island of romance, 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 romance. Water all around it, everywhere. Tropical trees and the salty air. But for me, the thing that's awaiting there, romance. It seems so distant, 26 miles away, resting in the water serene.
So that was a big hit for the Four Preps in the late 50s. And the lead singer of the Four Preps was a gentleman named Bruce Belland. And Bruce had two daughters named Tracey and Melissa. Tracey Bryn was born on May 17th, 1962. And her sister Melissa Brooke Belland was born February 17th, 1966. So they're about 4 years apart. Now, growing up in Santa Barbara, Tracey was into dance and Melissa was more into acting. As a matter of fact, the girls were child actresses and appeared in a handful of TV commercials when they were children. Now, Tracey was really into the British bands of like the late 70s, early 80s, Adam Ant, Bow Wow Wow, and the Pretenders. So she already had a love for British music. Both girls were also really into an emerging band in the late 70s from America called the B-52s. Now, in this whole kind of music scene of the late 70s, early 80s, both Melissa and Tracey used to say to themselves, wouldn't it be fun to be in a band someday? As many sisters often do. I'm sure my sisters and I have said it on numerous times as well. But that didn't actually happen, at least not initially. In her early 20s, Tracey, the older of the two sisters, decided to strike out on her own and traveled across Europe with her boyfriend. Now, while she was traveling, she fell in love with London, and she soon decided to sell everything she owned and move there. She was so in love with London that she wrote a song called Just a City about her love for London. We're going to talk about that song in a little bit. Now, Tracey's boyfriend at the time was in a band, and that band recorded a demo. Tracey's song, Just a City, actually ended up on the B side of that demo tape. Tracey's friend Mike Jones, who lived down the street from her in London, used his equipment to record it with Tracey on vocals. Now, the boyfriend shopped this demo out to a bunch of record labels, as one does. And somebody at Food Records listened to it, and they weren't too hot on the A side with Tracey's boyfriend, but they really did like the B side and what they heard of Tracey. Tracey and the boyfriend soon broke up, and Food Records offered Tracey a recording contract. So Tracey sent word to Melissa in California and said, hey, sis, come to London. We're going to make this happen. We're going to start a band. So Melissa joined Tracey in London, and interestingly enough, they both ended up singing backup vocals on Bill Drummond's 1986 folk album, The Man. Now, Polly, I know you know who Bill Drummond is. He's half of the musical genius behind KLF.
Yeah, that he is, and huge fan. And I somewhat have a recollection of him doing a solo album, and I'm really unsure whether I'd listened to it or listened to it and forgot about it. As you know, I have a bit of a visceral reaction when we're talking about folk, so I probably didn't get quite into it, even if I had listened to it. But yeah, top-notch guy, mysterious, elusive, great band. Check out KLF.
Well, so maybe this will spark your recollection a little bit if you've heard it or not, Polly. This is a song called I'm the King of Joy from Bill Drummond's solo album.
You can burn the bridge, flood the ford, storm the palace and block the road. Have a heart like a Viking with the faith of a child. Have you ever heard the song, Born to be Wild?
He's the king of joy. Oh, the king of joy.
I did a lot of loving, but then I got caught. The doctor said, boy, you've got to stop. I said, no, I've got to carry on. He said, fine, then take me along.
He's the king of joy. Oh, the king of joy.
So very interesting, very different than his electronic work with KLF and other bands. I know, Polly, you've already probably tuned out just at the mention of folk music there, but
Yeah, but you could actually say that's it's being kind of gracious, or maybe the opposite of gracious, saying that particular song is folk. It's folk-esque, but it's still a bit too up-tempo and a bit multi-instrumental to be straight up folk. So
okay.
it does have a couple of redeeming qualities.
So you'll give it a pass is what you're saying.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the redeeming qualities I would argue is actually the backup singers. So Melissa and Tracey are actually credited on the album sleeve as voice of the Beehive harmonies. Now, there's an urban legend, and I think the girls might have actually started this themselves, to be honest, but there's an urban legend that they took their name from a Bette Davis film, but there's no such film. And another urban legend I've heard is that they took their name from the wacky Beehive hairdos that like the B-52s used to do. But the truth is actually a lot less interesting. So the name Melissa means bee or honeybee in Greek. And that's actually where they took their name from. The voice of the Beehive, Melissa meaning bee. Still kind of neat and definitely a unique name. So the voice of the Beehive was signed to Food Records, and this was just like a one-off single deal. This was not like a full record contract. Food Records brought on Mark Bedford and Woody Woodgate to be the rhythm section. Now, Madness had just broken up in 86.
Yeah.
So Mark and Woody were, looking for the next gig. And along comes this offer from Food Records. So Tracey and Melissa, along with Mike Jones, the guy down the street who recorded the demo, Betters and Woody, went into the studio to record Just a City as a one-off single. Now let's listen to the single version of Just a City.
It's so near to me, it's so dear to me. I see it in my sleep, and I always know if I've nowhere to go, it's somewhere I could be. And I see you at night in the city lights, but it could change so easily. It's just a city, and on nights like this I feel small in this world. It's just a city, I am just a girl.
So that's a little bit different than the version that eventually made it onto an album. But as we mentioned, now this was the song that Tracey wrote because she just fell in love with the city of London as an American living abroad.
Yeah, well, if you do listen to the album version, it's interesting to note that we're talking about 1987. So, of course, this follows, the Bangles. And so, you'll find that there's similarities in sound, maybe through their whole repertoire, but, that's not being particularly fair to them. But if you think of what it predates, bands like Belly and Liz Phair, who would be trailing by 3, 4, or 5 years or something like that with a lot of their releases, I find those similarities much, much more interesting. And so, they were kind of, it would seem in 1987, a little bit stuck between the pop and what was really successful in the 1980s. And they were a little bit forward leaning, I would think, and trying to develop new sounds. And eventually those sounds would be flushed out by many bands. So good on them. They weren't relying on going by formula.
You mentioned similarities with Belly and Tanya Donnelly, and boy, I didn't catch that, but yeah, I definitely think there are some vocal similarities there. Another influence that Voice of the Beehive has cited in creating not just this single, but a lot of their sound was Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, and that they were going for that kind of a retro throwback. So this was released as a single by Food Records, and as I mentioned, it was a one-off. 1 month later, on the strength of this single, London Records offered the band a record deal. But Betters was a little bit tied up. He was starting to form Butterfield 8 with Terry Edwards. So he decided to take his leave. So he was with the band for that first single, but he was not with the band by the time that they had joined London Records.
And so in 1988, they do have a London Records release. It's Let It Be. Now, it was recorded at Puck Studios in Denmark. By this point, the band was a little bit more solidified. Of course, we have Tracey and Melissa. Tracey doing vocals and guitar, Melissa doing vocals. Mike Jones on guitar, vocals, keyboards, and programming. And of course, we have Woody, drums and percussion, triggers, and keyboard programming as well. Martin Brett, he came in on bass and piano. And Tracey is quoted as saying that she felt that Martin challenged Woody and made him a better drummer. So, interesting note there.
For sure. Woody, as we know from our episode way back when in 2021 about Woody, he always has had a much more varied background than just ska music. And so I think for him, this may have been a better fit for his personal leanings, his personal taste. You know what I mean?
Yes, it's possible that he was just interested in doing something a little bit different. But as we all know, he's also a fan of kind of heavier music too.
True.
Which he only had marginally fulfilled at one point in his career.
In terms of his drumming ability, he's very adaptable to many different kinds of sounds.
And the singles on the album, it would end up carrying a re-recording of Just the City. There'd be another song, I Say Nothing, that ended up going to number 11 on the U.S. modern rock charts. Let's take a listen.
Up in the morning and say, who the hell are you? And then she turned to me and said, we know you. Tell us some secrets, honey, we won't say a word, but I say nothing. I talk to no one. I know what I believe, don't need to wear it on my sleeve. I talk to no one, and I will say nothing. If we come and go alone, why do they need to know?
Pretty cool.
Yeah, I'd say this is a pretty strong song for them. Lyrically, at least, it's got a lot of cheekiness going on in there that you didn't really see in a lot of the mainstream pop. They always played it safe. But this, speaks a little bit from their perspective of a bit of a bad girl. So in that respect, I think they're making an attempt potentially to be a little bit edgy, but it doesn't detract from anything. It's pretty smart lyrically.
The next single after that was something called I Walk the Earth, which a lot of our fans will know. And then this is another one of their better known songs called Don't Call Me Baby. So, Polly, I was thinking of this song actually yesterday. I don't know if you caught the tail end of my Instagram drama. I had some guy out of the blue messaging me on Instagram, baby this and baby that, and oh, I'm looking for a new sugar baby, and baby, are you interested? And I wrote him back and I said, okay, first of all, stop calling me baby. It's disrespectful. I'm sorry. I am a middle-aged married college professor. I have no interest in being anybody's sugar baby. Good luck with that. But I was thinking of that. And this song was in my head as I was responding to him. Don't call me baby. So according to Tracey Bryn, I remembered a movie where Anne Margaret says, don't call me baby to Elvis Presley. I had liked the line so much, I'd written it down in my journal. So the lyrics of this song were actually written by Tracey with Mike Jones, and it's about Tracey's ex-boyfriend in America. Now, he used to borrow Tracey's car, and he'd say he was out running errands, but she later found out he was using the car to take another woman out. And that comes out in the lyrics of this song.
Yes, it's definitely a hooky song. I think in the chorus, it allows them to shine a little bit, at least in terms of their harmonies, which you might say sort of their signature move.
They do a very good job harmonizing with each other, Melissa and Tracey do. And honestly, that's a complaint that I have about many bands that have two female lead vocalists. Maybe not recording artists, but local bands that I've heard, where you'll have two female vocalists that don't harmonize with each other. They're actually just singing the same part.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts to sound very boring after a while. It starts to get very stale. So Melissa and Tracey did a really good job harmonizing with each other. And then there was one last single after this one, Polly, called Man in the Moon.
Now, bear in mind, this was for all intents and purposes, you might say like a UK album, recorded there, UK record label, although it was released in the United States. But back in the UK, the album reached number 13 on the albums charts and in its debut week. So altogether, pretty auspicious beginning. It peaked at number 53 in Australia on the ARIA albums chart and at number 40 in New Zealand. Back in the US, it received a lot of airplay on college radio stations, especially KROQ in Los Angeles.
Yeah, the legendary K-Rock. That's where a lot of big alternative bands started getting a lot of airplay. Kind of surprised, actually, that they didn't get more airplay in the U.S. after K-Rock picked them up.
Yeah, I would be too. Yeah. It seems, they did, like we said, I intimated a little bit that they had a sound not dissimilar from Bangles, not to pan on them. It was different, but it certainly was of the time, and you would think that it would have done a little bit better.
Yeah. So the next album they released was in 1991 called Honey Lingers, which is a little bit of a play on words, cunnilingus. Is that why you let me take this one? Because you wanted me to say cunnilingus?
Now, does it say that somewhere?
Yes.
Because, really?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Yes. I did not make that up. That actually came from a pretty reliable source.
All right.
They are cunning linguists. Anyway, this is the first album of theirs that I heard, not in its entirety, but I heard a lot of songs out of it. The big single off of this one was Monsters and Angels. So this was the Voice of the Beehive's biggest U.S. hit, peaking at number 74 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 8 on the U.S. Modern Rock charts. Let's play that one.
Nobody's Valentine and I'm nobody's pearl. When you get
Then their next single, which I am not going to play because it will get stuck in your head and never let go. Their cover of the Partridge Family song, I Think I Love You, which is clever. It did go to number 12 in Australia and 25 in the UK, but didn't really do anything here in the US. And finally, their third single, Perfect Place, which peaked in Australia at number 31 and 37 in the UK, but again, not much chart activity here in the US. This is Perfect Place.
'Cause not much is sacred. There's not really much to do here anymore. I don't feel like you said I walk the earth, my darling, but I never feel at home. And we all say I will change tomorrow.
This could be a perfect place.
I will change.
Could be a perfect place.
I will change tomorrow.
Could be a perfect place.
I will change it all tomorrow.
So Honey Lingers in general was critically acclaimed, but it didn't really sell as well as Let It Be. The album was certified silver in the UK for shipments of 60,000 units. And it peaked at number 68 on the Australian ARIA charts and number 17 on the UK albums chart. But again, didn't really chart in the US. However, it was still getting a lot of airplay, not just on K-Rock, but on a lot of college radio stations. You know, back in the late 80s, early 90s, up and coming bands, that's how they were getting exposure. If you wanted something that was alternative, that was not the mainstream, you tuned into the college radio stations. So then they released a greatest hits album in Canada only. I'm not sure why they made that decision, because they really hadn't had any chart activity in Canada up until that point. But it was called A Portrait. And that was again in 1991, and that was their greatest hits album.
And shortly after that release in Canada in 1991, the band more or less began to fragment. The band members were frustrated with London Records' seeming inability to market their music. Woody, as we know, would end up returning to Madness in 1992. Martin Brett, as it turned out, had family commitments. Mike Jones wanted to go in a different direction musically, so the band sought to be released from their London Records contract. Despite this, they managed to contribute a version of the Rolling Stones' Gimme Shelter to a 1993 EMI collection of covers of the song. They collaborated with Jimmy Somerville of Bronsky Beat.
The storm is threatening my very life today. If I don't get some shelter, oh yeah, I'm gonna fade away. War to land, it's just a shot away, it's just a shot away. War to land, it's just a shot away, it's just a shot away.
Very interesting take on that song. Had you heard this one before, Polly?
I have, yeah. I do actually. I can't quite remember if this appears on the Jimmy Somerville and Bronsky Beat sort of greatest hits thing, but at least at some point I made it a point to go out and look up everything Jimmy Somerville. I'm a huge fan.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately for Voice of the Beehive, Jimmy Somerville really, really outshines them on this. You know, he does much better, as is his trademark falsetto, sort of imagining or paying homage to the Mary Clayton backup vocals on Gimme Shelter of the Stones version. So I just can't say enough great things about Jimmy Somerville in this. And it was great that he got to do a voice of the Beehive. No shame on them. They did really, really well. And this is probably, I think, their best offering of all.
I agree with you. I think Jimmy Somerville really kind of takes center stage. I mean, as he tends to do. There was another cover that Tracey and Melissa had done a few years prior to this, and it doesn't get a lot of mention. It was credited to Tracey and Melissa Beehive, not voice of the Beehive. And this was in, I think, 88. They did a very interesting cover of the Johnny Cash song, 5 Feet High and Rising. So if it's okay with you, Polly, I want to play a little snippet of this one too.
Go right ahead.
How high's the water, mama?
Well, it's 2 feet high and rising.
How high's the water, papa?
2 feet high and rising. We can make it to the road in a homemade boat. The only thing we've got left to float is already over the wheat and oats. 2 feet high and rising.
How high's the water, mama?
Well, it's 3 feet high and rising.
How high's the water, papa?
Said 3 feet high and rising.
Well, the highs are gone. I lost my bees. Chickens are sleeping in the willow trees.
So completely different sound. This is definitely a very country vibe to it. I mean, as was the original. So they're definitely exploring some different musical avenues here. One of the things that we had mentioned earlier is one of their very early influences was the B-52s. And again, speaking of the idea of 2 female leads doing harmony, Cindy and Kate from the B-52s and Melissa and Tracey here, you can really hear that B-52s influence. All right. So coming on the heels of that, you mentioned the 1993 recording with Jimmy Somerville. By 95, as you said, the band, they all went their separate ways, and Tracey and Melissa moved back to California. While they were there, they signed to East West Records. They finally did get out of their London Records contract. While at East West Records, the girls joined forces with keyboard player Peter Vettis, who had previously produced Annie Lennox's solo album, Diva. That was what, 92, Diva? I think it was 92.
You got me.
I think it was about 92 or so. So he'd already made a big name for himself as a producer at that point. Tracey, Melissa, and Peter, as a trio, worked on a new album and a new sound. There was also some collaboration here with Andy Partridge of XTC, who shares a writing credit on the song Blue in Paradise. Now, Tracey described working with Andy as the best experience of her life. So the album Sex and Misery was released in the UK, but there was not much fanfare. And Discovery Records actually released the album in the US. They picked it up off of East West. So the singles of this album, first, they released the single Angel Come Down in the UK. And that was, I think, done by the label. They wanted to gauge interest to see if people were still interested in Voice of the Beehive. However, they quickly pulled it. Then they released the single Scary Kisses. And this was a modest hit in the US, reaching number 77 on the Billboard Hot 100. This is Scary Kisses.
You can see them living sensibly with lots of care.
Scary Kisses.
So Scary Kisses, a bit of a departure for them. Like you said, they were working on a new sound. And I really felt, for my taste, that a faster tempo works a great deal better for them. If you're doing slower songs, there's no end to the amount of harmonies you can fit in there. Faster tempo, much harder to do. You can certainly do it. You could do harmonies anywhere and for any reason you want. But on an up-tempo song, a lot less room for it. And I feel that this is them also kind of breaking away from the pack. When we talked about, the similarities maybe in some of their sound to other artists, here, I really don't, nothing jumps to mind.
Okay.
So I really think this is them developing their own voice, as it were. There's no pun there, people.
So it's definitely got kind of a Manchester vibe, or like The Farm, doesn't it? Very up-tempo. I think they really are striking out and finding their own sound. So after this, the label decided to release another UK-only single called Heavenly, and then another US single called So Hard. Now, I'm not really sure what the strategy was here, why we're releasing some singles in the US, some in the UK. Keep in mind that this is 96. This is like the very, very earliest days of the internet. There was still kind of a fractured market. I think now with social media and the internet and everything, I think there's much more potential for people to go international, when they're performers, because it reaches the overseas so quickly. But in 96, that still wasn't really happening. So I kind of question why they decided to do it this way.
And so it would seem, after the relative failure of Sex and Misery, that there would be no more Voice of the Beehive offerings in earnest. And so, more or less, the band was truly broken up at that point. As we know, Martin Brett had moved on. By this point, he had formed the Brett Dempsey Music Productions. Mike Jones lives in Norwich, where he still plays guitar. Of course, we know Woody and Betters were back with Madness and continue to be to this day, thankfully. But the two sisters, Tracey, well, she went home and became a teacher in California. Melissa began the Made in Heaven clothing company.
So that's kind of where it stood until fairly recently. In September 2022, the record label wanted to re-release a 35th anniversary edition of Let It Be, which, as I mentioned, has a bunch of, B-sides, demo tracks, that kind of stuff. And Voice of the Beehive went back into the studio to record a new single as part of this re-release, and that was Cartoon City. This was released in September of last year, 2022. Let's give a listen.
Come out in bubbles. We run from all the criminals and just redraw our troubles. This is Cartoon City, colors of a big box suit. Do your hair however you like. This is Cartoon City, and every scene's a photograph. See that things are so damn great. Find it hard to concentrate.
So that was really exciting to finally have something new from the Voice of the Beehive after all these years. And they definitely got back to their roots, They think they got back to their original sound. Did you get a chance to listen to this one, Polly?
Yeah, I did. And by merit of it being so new, I was unfamiliar with it altogether. And it just did not do a great deal for me. It seemed like fairly rudimentary songwriting.
Okay, that's fair. Polly, you said something earlier that really struck me, that I guess I really hadn't pondered. And that is that this really hit right before the big kind of Lilith Fair girl power pop that we kind of started to see around the early 90s. So maybe they were a little ahead of their time. Maybe if they'd been a little bit later, they would have been a little bit bigger. And, I'd be hard pressed to say, whether they actually had any influence on any of the bands that you mentioned, like Belly or Liz Phair, Breeders, any of that kind of stuff. I would imagine that they would, but, who can say? Who can say whether or not they were actually an influence or not? I do think that it's cool as a Madness fan, because I think it really showcases Woody's versatility, that, he really can fit into a variety of different genres and a variety of different sounds. And it is really kind of light, fun power pop. It's enjoyable to listen to. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me see, because I don't feel obligated to necessarily be too diplomatic about it. This was never really going to be my cup of tea, So here we have two very talented young women that are, fans of pop music, I think, first and foremost. And I think they're living out their, teenage dreams kind of, and they are writing music that to me seems like eternally for teenage girls. And there's just no shame in that.
One other thing that I noticed, I'm sorry.
I'm done.
If you look at the tour schedule, Voice of the Beehive toured the US a lot more than Madness ever did. They had several American tours. So I don't know. I thought that was interesting just because, Woody finally did get to tour and see the US, but the rest of the guys didn't. And I guess that kind of leads me back to, come on, boys, we are waiting for our promised American tour. Am I being salty? am I beating on a dead horse there? I don't know. And anything else about Voice of the Beehive?
Nope, we're good.
Okay. So we're working on another episode for you in 2 weeks, but today I'd like to leave with a song that is important to me. This is actually probably the first song I ever heard by the Voice of the Beehive. I was working in a mall as assistant manager of a very trendy clothing store, and we had one of those piped in music services, that's specifically chosen for our store's demographic. And this song was on one of the tapes that we used to play in the store, and that is Adonis Blue. And I had no idea who they were. I didn't know anything about them. I certainly didn't know that there was a connection to Madness, but I really fell in love with this song. So I'd like to share it with you and with our listeners. So we're going to end with Adonis Blue by Voice of the Beehive. And on that note, it's a goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from me. Go get a beer, Stateside Madness.
I'll give myself a vision of a boy for this one girl. He can be the colors of a a wish when the clock strikes certain hours. Blow out the candles on my cake, put some pennies in the fountain. Godspeed him to me, I promise I'll be good. I'll be waiting by the window, I'll be sitting in the dark. You just gotta be there cause I look so very The dawn is blue, I look so very hard. Can't find me, I can't find you. You tried and true, it's only you. A dawn is blue, is a boy come true. He's a little bit of him, a little bit of you. A cherub face with those dark in heels. He's everything I mean, he's everything I feel. Ragdoll singing in the slippery city rain. Bugging in my circuits, dancing in my brain. A dawn is blue, he's a boy divine. Gonna try to find him, gonna make him mine. Can't find me, I can't find you. You tried and true. If I only knew the dawn is blue. I give myself a vision